October 1940, at the Messerschmitt design offices in Leipheim, Germany. It was exactly 9 a.m. when the engineering team gathered around a set of blueprints that seemed more like a fever dream than a viable military project. The German High Command had issued a desperate ultimatum for a heavy-lift transport capable of carrying the weight of an entire invasion force across the English Channel for Operation Sea Lion. The standard Junkers Ju-52, while reliable, was a mere toy compared to what was now required. They needed a vessel that could carry a Panzer IV tank, an 88mm flak gun, or 130 fully equipped paratroopers. This demand gave birth to the Me 321, a glider of such staggering proportions that it was immediately nicknamed the Gigant. The Me 321 was a marvel of improvisational engineering. Constructed primarily of steel tubing and fabric to save on precious light alloys, it possessed a wingspan of 55 meters. However, the sheer mass of the glider created a problem that defied the physics of the era. It was so heavy that no single aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory could pull it into the air. By 2 p.m. on the days of the early flight tests, the airfield would be a scene of orchestrated chaos as pilots attempted the Troika Schlepp. This was a terrifying maneuver where 3 Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters were harnessed to the glider in a V formation. The pilots had to synchronize their throttles perfectly. If one plane veered off course or lost power, the resulting tension on the cables would drag all 4 aircraft into a catastrophic collision. The danger was so pronounced that the Luftwaffe eventually developed the Heinkel He 111 Zwilling, a twin fuselage monstrosity created by joining 2 bombers together at the wing. But even with this dedicated tug, the Me 321 remained a prisoner of its own design. It was a one-way weapon, difficult to recover once landed and entirely dependent on other aircraft for its mobility. The realization that the glider was a logistical dead hit the Reichsluftfahrtministerium hard. They knew that if the war was to be won on distant fronts like North Africa or the Soviet Union, the Gigant needed its own heart. It needed engines. In the spring of 1941, the transformation began. The transition from the Me 321 glider to the powered Me 323 was not a subtle upgrade. It was a total reimagining of heavy transport. To avoid diverting German engine production from fighter planes, the engineers turned to captured French stocks. They selected the Gnome 14N radial engine, a reliable power plant that was available in large numbers. It was 11:15 a.m. when the first prototypes were fitted with 4 engines. But the test flights proved that 4 were not enough to lift the beast and its cargo. The design was quickly revised to feature 6 engines spread across the massive leading edge of the wings. This 6-engine configuration turned the Me 323 into the ultimate monster of the skies. It featured a revolutionary landing gear system consisting of 10 wheels on each side, housed in massive aerodynamic fairings, allowing it to land on the uneven, muddy runways of the Eastern Front. The most striking feature remained the nose. 2 gargantuan clamshell doors swung open like the maw of a whale, allowing a truck or a tank to drive directly into the belly of the plane. Inside, the fuselage felt less like an aircraft and more like a flying cathedral of steel ribs and taut fabric. As the first production models rolled out, the Me 323 Gigant represented a peak of ambitious aeronautics. Yet, it was a slow, lumbering target. With a cruising speed that rarely exceeded 200 kilometers per hour, it was a sitting duck for any Allied fighter that happened upon it. By 4 p.m., during its operational sorties over the Mediterranean, the Gigant often found itself fighting a losing battle against gravity and enemy fire. The birth of this behemoth reflects the frantic energy of a mid-war Germany trying to solve impossible logistical problems with brute force engineering. The Me 323 was a bridge between the era of silent gliders and the future of strategic heavy lift, but it was a bridge built on the shifting sands of a failing empire. It remains a poignant symbol of technical genius applied to a lost cause. The Gigant was a machine that commanded respect for its scale, but invited tragedy through its vulnerability. It stands in history as a testament to the fact that in the theater of war, being the biggest actor on the stage often means you are the one with the most to lose when the curtain finally falls. January 1942, at the Messerschmitt facility in Leipheim, German engineers stood beneath a wing so vast it seemed to block out the very sky they entered to conquer. The transition from the massive Me 321 glider to the powered Me 323 Gigant was not merely an upgrade. It was an act of desperation born from the realization that no existing aircraft could safely tow such a beast into combat. The solution was to turn the glider into a self-sufficient monster, a task that required a radical rethink of aeronautical limits. They looked to the spoils of war to provide the heart of this machine, selecting the French-built Gnome 14N radial engines. By 3 p.m. on a cold testing day, the roar of 6 of these power plants would signal a new era of heavy lift, though one fraught with mechanical compromise and technical audacity. Each of these 14-cylinder engines produced roughly 100 horsepower, giving the Gigant a total output that sounds impressive on paper, yet struggled to move the massive airframe with any sense of urgency. The choice of 6 engines was born from necessity. Initial tests with 4 engines proved the aircraft was woefully underpowered for the payloads the Luftwaffe demanded. With a wingspan stretching over 180 feet, the Me 323 was a sprawling skeleton of steel tubing, braced with wooden ribs and covered almost entirely in doped fabric. It was a construction method more suited to a biplane from the previous decade, yet scaled up to a size that defied logic. This reliance on non-strategic materials was a clever bypass of Germany's critical aluminum shortages, but it turned the Gigant into a flying tinderbox, vulnerable to even the smallest spark of incendiary fire from an Allied interceptor. To support its weight on the rough, unpaved runways of the Eastern Front and North Africa, the engineers devised an ingenious landing gear system. They installed 10 wheels, 5 on each side, housed in long aerodynamic fairings that gave the plane its distinctive, heavy-set profile. This arrangement allowed the Gigant to distribute its massive 45-ton maximum takeoff weight across a larger surface area, preventing it from sinking into the soft mud of a Russian spring. When it touched down at 4 p.m., after a grueling transport run, the sight of those 10 wheels biting into the dirt was a marvel of ground pressure engineering. But the real genius of the design lay at the very front of the aircraft. The nose featured 2 massive clamshell doors that swung outward, revealing a cavernous hold where a Panzer IV tank or 2 4-ton trucks could be driven straight into the belly of the plane. This internal volume was over 3,500 cubic feet, a space that felt more like a logistical warehouse than a fuselage. Inside the cockpit, the pilot sat nearly 20 feet above the ground, peering through a greenhouse of glass panels. Flight controls were incredibly heavy and unresponsive, requiring immense physical strength to manipulate the huge control surfaces. Because the wings were so thick, the design included internal catwalks within the structure itself. A flight engineer could actually crawl into the wing during flight to access the engines, performing minor repairs or adjusting fuel mixtures while thousands of feet in the air. This was an era where the machine was as much a living building as it was an aircraft. At its cruising speed of barely 135 miles per hour, the Gigant was less a hawk and more a floating island. It was a sitting duck for any Allied fighter pilot who stumbled upon it. Yet, the technical specifications told a story of incredible utility. It could carry 130 combat-equipped troops or nearly 12 tons of equipment over a range of 500 miles. The fuel system was equally immense, consisting of 6 large tanks buried within the wing structure. In early models, these were not self-sealing, which meant a single tracer bullet could ignite the entire wing and seal the fate of everyone on board. The engineers attempted to mitigate the danger by installing up to 18 machine gun positions throughout the fuselage, including upper wing positions where gunners sat in the open air, exposed to the freezing slipstream. These technical compromises highlight the central tragedy of the Gigant. It was a masterpiece of good enough engineering, using what was available to do what was thought to be impossible. It was a bridge between the era of wooden gliders and the future of strategic heavy lift. The legacy of the six-engine monster is found in every heavy lift wing currently patrolling the skies of the 21st century. It taught the world that while size can provide a temporary advantage, it is the integration of power, protection, and purpose that truly defines a ruler of the air. The Gigant was a giant with feet of clay, a technical marvel that was ultimately too large for the world it tried to change, leaving behind only the echoes of its 6 engines and the ghost of a design that was simply ahead of its time. It remains a staggering example of how far human ingenuity can be pushed when the pressures of survival and the ambitions of empire collide. A testament to the brilliance and the blind spots of the men who dared to build a monster. January 20, 1943. Over the turquoise expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, a shadow larger than any ever seen in the history of aerial warfare cast its silhouette upon the waves. This was the Me 323 Gigant in its element, not as a prototype or a dream, but as the backbone of a desperate logistical gamble. While the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe grabbed the headlines with their dogfights and kill counts, it was this 6-engine Leviathan that represented the true evolution of German military reach. The Gigant was the answer to a question that had plagued every conquering army since antiquity. How do you move the heavy steel of modern war faster than the enemy can react? Before the Gigant, heavy equipment was the prisoner of the rail line and the slow-moving merchant ship. If a Tiger tank or an 88mm flak gun was needed at the front, it meant weeks of planning and the constant threat of naval blockade. The Gigant changed that paradigm overnight. With its massive clamshell nose doors swinging wide, the aircraft could swallow a Panzer II tank or a fully loaded half-track as easily as a transport truck takes on a crate of ammunition. It was the world's first true strategic airlifter, capable of hauling 12 tons of cargo across distances that rendered traditional logistics obsolete. At 11 a.m. on a typical transport day, the airfields of Italy would buzz with a frantic industrial energy. Mechanics would swarm the 6 French-made Gnome-Rhone engines, coaxing the 1100 horsepower power plants into a synchronized roar. The interior of the plane was cavernous, a ribbed cathedral of steel tubing and fabric that could accommodate 120 fully equipped paratroopers or a mountain of supplies that would otherwise require an entire train of wagons. It was a mobilization of force that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. In the heat of the Tunisian campaign, these giants became the umbilical cord for the Afrika Korps, ferrying the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht across the sea in a fraction of the time a convoy would take. Yet, this logistical revolution came with a terrifying price. To achieve such massive lift, the Gigant was constructed largely of steel tubing and doped fabric, making it a flying tinderbox. By 3 p.m. on a clear day, a Gigant caught without a heavy fighter escort was little more than a slow-moving target for Allied Spitfires and P-40s. The very size that made it a miracle of logistics made it a nightmare in combat. Pilots recounted stories of the aircraft being riddled with incendiary rounds, the fabric skin peeling away in flames while the crew struggled to keep the massive frame level. It was a high-stakes game of chess, where the prize was the survival of an entire army group. The most harrowing moment for the fleet came on April 22, 1943. A massive formation of Gigants, laden with fuel and vital supplies for the crumbling front in North Africa, was intercepted by Allied fighters. In a matter of minutes, the sky was filled with the falling wreckage of the giants. It was a slaughter that highlighted the tragic flaw of the design. You cannot move the weight of a world-changing empire in a vessel held together by hope and cloth. The legacy of the Me 323, however, extends far beyond its fiery in the Mediterranean. It proved that the future of warfare was not just about the speed of the bullet, but the speed of the supply chain. The concept of the nose-loading heavy lifter, the multi-wheel landing gear to distribute weight on unpaved runways, and the sheer audacity of moving entire mechanized units by air became the blueprint for the modern age. Every C-5 Galaxy and Antonov transport that roars through the clouds today carries the DNA of the Gigant. It was a machine that attempted to bridge the gap between the industrial capacity of the 20th century and the limitless horizons of the future. The Gigant remains a haunting reminder that while technology can provide the means to conquer vast distances, it cannot outpace the grinding reality of a war of attrition. It was a revolution in logistics that arrived too late for its creators, but changed the way the world moves forever. A titan of the clouds that taught us that to rule the earth, one must first master the burden of the sky. November 1942, Trapani Airfield, Sicily, the sun rose over a desperate scene that would define the limits of aerial logistics in the heat of total war. The German Afrika Korps was starving for supplies, their tanks stalled in the sand, and their men running low on ammunition as the Royal Navy effectively severed the Mediterranean sea lanes. In this hour of crisis, the High Command turned to the only machine capable of carrying the heavy equipment needed to sustain a mechanized army across the sea. The Messerschmitt Me 300T3 Gigant was no longer just an experimental marvel. It became the vital artery of a dying campaign, a bridge made of steel and canvas that spanned the dangerous gap between the Italian mainland and the Tunisian coast. The sheer scale of the operation began in the early morning darkness when the ground crews prepared these six-engined leviathans for the journey ahead. By 5 a.m., the air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the deafening roar of gnome-roan engines warming up across the tarmac. The Gigant's most striking feature was its immense nose doors, which swung open like the jaws of a whale to reveal a cavernous interior. Unlike any other aircraft of the era, the Me 323 could accommodate cargo that seemed to defy the laws of flight. Whole platoons of soldiers would march into the belly of the plane, followed by heavy trucks and even Panzer II tanks that were driven directly onto the reinforced wooden floor. It was a sight that bordered on the surreal, a massive bird of prey swallowing the machinery of modern ground warfare. At 8:15 a.m., the heavily laden formations would begin their perilous journey. Taking off in a Gigant was a feat of engineering and nerves, often requiring the assistance of liquid fuel rockets mounted under the wings to provide the extra thrust needed to lift nearly 100,000 pounds of weight into the sky. Once airborne, the pilots faced a terrifying reality. They were flying at a cruising speed of barely 140 miles per hour, making them easy prey for any Allied fighter that happened to cross their path. To minimize the risk, the formations flew at extreme low altitudes, often no more than 50 feet above the whitecaps of the Mediterranean. They moved like a fleet of ghost ships, their shadows dancing on the water as they tried to slip past the radar net of the British forces on Malta. By 11 a.m., the first of the Giants would typically touch down at Bizerte or Tunis, their arrivals greeted with relief by the exhausted troops of the desert front. The impact of these flights was immediate. A single Me 323 could deliver in hours what a merchant ship would take days to transport, assuming that ship was not intercepted by a submarine. Between November and the following spring, these aircraft performed a miracle of logistics, flying over 4,000 missions and transporting thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Yet, the price of this aerial bridge was paid in blood. The aircraft was notoriously vulnerable, earning it the grim nickname of the flying coffin among its crews. If a single incendiary round struck the wooden frame or the fuel barrels stored in the hold, the aircraft became a localized inferno from which there was almost no escape. The tragedy reached its peak at 9:30 a.m. on April 22, 1943. A massive formation of 21 Me 323s, carrying the final reserves of fuel for the crumbling Axis defense, was intercepted by Allied P-40 Warhawks and Spitfires. What followed was a massacre that illuminated the sky for miles. The Allied pilots watched in awe as the massive transports, too slow to maneuver and too large to miss, were systematically torn to pieces. Within minutes, 16 of the 21 aircraft had crashed into the sea, taking their crews and their precious cargo with them. It was a blow that effectively shattered the German Air Transport Command in the Mediterranean and signaled the end of any hope for Rommel's forces in Africa. Looking back at the smoke-filled skies over the Tunisian coast, the Me 323 stands as a profound symbol of the transition in modern warfare. It proved that the ultimate decider of conflict is not the strength of the soldier's arm, but the length and resilience of the supply line. It was the first true strategic airlifter, the direct ancestor of the massive cargo planes that today serve as the backbone of global power projection and humanitarian relief. The Gigant was a machine that attempted to defy the constraints of geography and the limitations of technology, a titan that carried the impossible weight of a failing empire. Its legacy is a haunting reminder that in the theater of war, even the most revolutionary technology is subject to the cold, hard mathematics of attrition. It remains a testament to human ingenuity and the desperate reaches of ambition, a ghost in the clouds that taught the world that to truly control the earth, one must first master the unforgiving burden of the sky. April 22, 1943, over the sparkling but treacherous waters of the Sicilian Strait, the sheer audacity of German engineering met its most brutal reckoning. As the sun climbed higher, a massive formation of 16 Messerschmitt 323 Gigants lumbered through the air, their 6 engines humming in a low, vibrating chorus that could be felt in the bones of the men inside. They were a desperate lifeline for the Africa Corps, filled to the brim with fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements inted to bolster a front that was rapidly collapsing. At 9 a.m., the mission seemed routine, a heavy lifting chore carried out under the assumption that their sheer size and defensive machine guns might offer some semblance of protection. But the Gigant was never meant for a sky contested by agile hunters. By 10 a.m., the horizon was no longer empty. The Allied forces had cracked the German codes and knew exactly when and where these leviathans would appear. A swarm of P-40 Warhawks and Spitfires dashed from the clouds like hawks onto a line of flightless herons. The combat reality of the Me 323 was immediately laid bare. While it was a marvel of logistics, it was a nightmare in an engagement. Its skin was not reinforced aluminum, but stretched fabric over a skeleton of steel tubing. To an Allied pilot, the Gigant was not a terrifying monster of war, but a massive, slow-moving target that was almost impossible to miss. As the first incendiary rounds tore into the leading aircraft, the tragedy of its design became a fiery reality. The fabric ignited instantly, and the massive fuel tanks hidden within the wings turned the aircraft into a flying funeral pyre. Witnesses from the escorting German fighters watched in horror as the giant aircraft began to disintegrate. Because of its massive wingspan and low speed, the Me 323 could not take evasive maneuvers. It was a prisoner of its own physics. By 10:20 a.m., the sea below was dotted with the burning wreckage of the pride of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet. Out of the 16 giants that had set out that morning, not one reached its destination. The massacre was so complete that it effectively ended the use of the Me 323 in large-scale daylight formations in the Mediterranean theater. The technical brilliance of the nose-loading doors and the heavy lift capacity meant nothing when the aircraft lacked the speed to outrun a pursuit or the armor to survive a single well-placed burst of fire. The maintenance of these monsters was a war of attrition in itself. The 6 gnome-roan engines were temperamental and required constant attention from ground crews, who were often working in primitive conditions with dwindling supplies. A single engine failure would not down the craft, but it would drop its cruising speed to a crawl, making it an even easier prey for patrolling Allied squadrons. By the time the sun began to set at 7 p.m. on the days following these major losses, the German High Command had to face the cold, hard mathematics of their situation. They were losing airframes faster than they could build them, and the pilots and crews being lost were some of the most experienced transporters in the world. As the war progressed, the survivors were relegated to the Eastern Front, where they operated under the cover of darkness, or in sectors where Soviet air power was spread thin. Yet even there, the vulnerability of the Titan remained its defining characteristic. It was a machine built for a world of total air dominance, a world that the Third Reich no longer inhabited. The Gigant was a victim of its own ambition, a design that prioritized the quantity of cargo over the survival of the crew. In the sky is an unforgiving judge of hubris. The Messerschmitt 323 remains a haunting silhouette in the history of aviation, a reminder that size is often a precursor to fragility. It stands as a testament to a regime that attempted to solve the problems of geography and distance with sheer mass, only to find that in the theater of modern war, the biggest targets are the first to fall. Its legacy is one of smoke and aluminum at the bottom of the sea, a ghost of an empire that thought it could conquer the heavens without first respecting the lethal speed of the wind and the relentless precision of the enemy. April 1944, near the besieged port of Sevastopol, the last few giants of the Luftwaffe were forced to confront a sky that no longer belonged to them. By this stage of the war, the Messerschmitt 323 Gigant had evolved from a marvel of heavy lift capacity into a tragic symbol of German industrial overreach. The technical limitations that had been overlooked during its frantic development were now manifesting as fatal flaws under the pressure of the Soviet advance and the tightening noose of Allied air superiority. The most glaring issue was the sheer physical presence of the aircraft. At a time when survival in the air depended on speed and maneuverability, the Gigant offered neither. Its 6 gnome-roan radial engines, salvaged from occupied France, were reliable in a vacuum, but lacked the collective power to move such a massive frame with any sense of urgency. When fully loaded with 20 tons of equipment, or over 100 combat troops, the aircraft groaned under the atmospheric strain, struggling to maintain a cruising speed that barely exceeded 130 miles per hour. The maintenance crews at airfields like Odessa worked around the clock, but they were fighting a losing battle against the machine's complexity. Managing 6 temperamental engines meant that if a single spark plug fouled or a fuel line leaked during takeoff, the entire mission had to be scrubbed. At 11 a.m. on typical operational days, the ground crews would often find themselves cannibalizing 3 separate airframes just to get one airworthy for the evening transport run. This mechanical fragility was compounded by the aircraft's construction. Despite its size, the Gigant was essentially a skeleton of steel tubing covered in doped fabric and plywood. It was a cavernous, hollow shell that lacked any meaningful armor plating for the pilots or the vital fuel cells. For an enemy fighter pilot, spotting a 323 was like finding a slow-moving mountain of tinder. A single concentrated burst of incendiary rounds from a Mustang or a Yak-9 could turn the majestic transport into a plummeting inferno within seconds. By 2 p.m. on the many days of the Crimean evacuation, the sky would often be filled with the black smoke of downed Messerschmitts. The crews knew the risks. To fly a Gigant in 1944 was to accept that you were piloting the largest target in Europe. The aircraft's defensive armament, consisting of several 13mm machine guns, poked through windows and top turrets, was a psychological comfort more than a tactical deterrent. The gunners had massive blind spots, and the vibration from the 6 engines made precision aiming nearly impossible. Furthermore, the landing gear, a complex arrangement of 10 wheels designed to distribute weight on rough frontline strips, frequently buckled or trapped mud, leading to ground loops that destroyed the aircraft before they could even take flight. As the German front lines collapsed, the strategic value of a high-volume transport remained high. But the cost of operation became unbearable. The High Command in Berlin watched the attrition rates with growing alarm. In one disastrous engagement over the Mediterranean earlier in the conflict, nearly an entire wing of these aircraft had been wiped out in minutes, and the lessons of that slaughter were finally being applied to the production lines of 1944. The realization had set in. Mass was not a substitute for defense. In April 1944, the order finally came down from the Ministry of Aviation to cease all production of the Me 323. The resources, the aluminum, and the skilled labor were desperately needed for the emergency fighter program, specifically for the production of the Me 262 jet and other interceptors intended to stop the Allied bombing raids. The Gigant's era had ended, not because the need for transport had vanished, but because the sky had become too lethal for a monster that could only crawl. The of the Gigant program reflects a broader turning point in the history of flight, marking the moment where the dream of the superplane collided with the cold reality of industrial warfare. It stands as a reminder that in the evolution of technology, size often invites its own destruction when it is not matched by the grace of speed. The legacy of these six-engine behemoths is one of ambition decoupled from pragmatism. They were the product of a regime that believed sheer scale could overwhelm the physics of the battlefield, only to learn that a giant is most vulnerable when it has nowhere to hide. Today, no complete Me 323 remains, leaving only grainy footage and rusted wreckage at the bottom of the sea to tell the story of a mechanical titan that was simply too large to survive the fires of the 20th century. It remains a ghost of a lost aviation philosophy, a monument to the idea that in the theater of war, the greatest heights are often followed by the swiftest and most silent falls. May 4, 1945, at the Recklinlers airfield, the silence of a dying empire was broken only by the crackle of burning documents and the distant, rhythmic rumble of approaching Soviet armor. Among the twisted wreckage of the Reich's once vaunted Luftwaffe lay the mangled skeletons of the Messerschmitt 323, their 6 engines stilled and their vast, canvas-covered wings torn to ribbons by the very winds of change they were meant to master. These giants, born from the urgent, desperate necessity of the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front, had become nothing more than scrap metal and cautionary tales. To look upon the Gigant in those final hours was to see the physical embodiment of a regime that had mistaken size for strength and audacity for immortality. It was the of an era of monsters, and the beginning of a long, cold reflection on what it means to build a machine that is simply too large for the world it inhabits. The engineering legacy of the Me 323 is a complex, haunting tapestry of visionary design and desperate, improvised survival. It was, for all its flaws, the first true heavy-lift transport aircraft in history. It was a machine that proved you could move entire battalions, light tanks, and heavy artillery through the clouds, effectively shrinking the battlefield and redefining the logistics of modern war. In many ways, the DNA of the modern strategic airlifter begins in the wooden ribs and steel tubing of the Gigant. When we look at the silhouettes of a C-5 Galaxy or an Antonov 124 today, we are seeing the refined, perfected descants of a concept that the Me 323 pioneered in the most brutal conditions imaginable. But where modern aviation prioritizes survivability, stealth, and integrated defense systems, the Gigant was a product of a different, far more reckless philosophy. It was built with the arrogant hope that its sheer presence would be enough to overwhelm the enemy, ignoring the reality that a slow, 6-engine behemoth was little more than a target for any pilot with a steady hand. At 2 p.m., on a clear spring afternoon during the height of the war, it was easy to be awed by the shadow of such a beast crossing the land. It was a dark, moving cross that seemed to blot out the sun itself, a mechanical god descending from the heavens. But that shadow was cast by a machine held together by little more than paper-thin fabric and faith, a titan with a glass jaw that could be shattered by a single well-placed burst of machine gun fire. The cost of this scale was not just measured in fuel or raw materials, but in the lives of the crews who were sent up in what were effectively flying tinderboxes. They flew into the teeth of Allied air superiority, knowing that a single incendiary round could turn their massive cargo hold into a furnace from which there was no escape. This was the tragedy of the Gigant. It was an engineering marvel that arrived in a world that had already evolved beyond its primitive capabilities. A machine that belonged to a fantasy of war rather than the reality of it. The Me 323 remains a monument to the hubris of total war. It represented the belief that the laws of physics and the cold realities of logistics could be bent to the iron will of a centralized command. The Luftwaffe leadership saw a giant that could carry the weight of an army, but they failed to see the vulnerability inherent in that very size. Every time a Gigant was lost over the waves of the Mediterranean or the mud of the Russian steppe, it wasn't just a plane that went down. It was a massive investment of national resources. A specialized crew of highly trained men and a cargo that could have turned the tide of a local skirmish. The scale that made it legendary also made it an unsustainable liability. It was a machine designed for a victory that was never coming, a tool for a conquest that had already stalled under the weight of its own ambition. As we look back through the fog of 8 decades, the Me 323 stands as a ghost in the annals of flight. It is a reminder that in the evolution of technology, the largest specimens are often the ones that cannot adapt to a rapidly changing environment. We see this pattern throughout history, where the pursuit of the gargantuan leads to a sudden and catastrophic extinction. The Gigant was the ultimate expression of this drive, a mechanical dinosaur that ruled the skies for a fleeting, violent moment before the fire of modern combat proved too intense for its fragile frame. Today, there are no grand museums where you can walk beneath the shadow of a Me 323 and touch its wings. There are no restored engines that roar to life at air shows to remind us of their power. The Gigant exists only in the grainy, flickering frames of old propaganda films and the silent, salt-encrusted ruins resting on the dark floor of the Mediterranean Sea. These wrecks serve as a poignant closing thought on the nature of ambition. They tell us that while human ingenuity can build monsters that touch the stars, no amount of steel or canvas can protect a creation from the fundamental flaws of the spirit that built it. The Gigant fell because it was too big to hide and too slow to run, a victim of its own magnitude in a world that had no room for errors. It remains a haunting symbol of a time when the world was consumed by fire, and the tallest trees were the first to be felled by the storm. In the legacy of the 6-engine monster is not found in the weight it carried, but in the profound emptiness it left behind when the era of the giants finally came to an